go over. We treated those things when we were doing the intro with Java, but now we're going to look at how those things can be done in Dart. Because for the next sessions in Flutter, we are going to sort of need that knowledge. So we are going to go through those things, and that's one of the. We are going to look at classes in Dart. We're also going to look at some types, data types in Flutter as well. Yeah, which kinds of arrays and all of those things. And we're going to also look at loops. So that's what we're going to do today. And yeah, let me share my screen and let's get started. Can you see my screen, please?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, I remember the first class we had.
You can increase your text size.
Okay. I remember the first class we had after we split into various classes. The first class we had as mobile class. I shared a link to the Dart language tour and asked that we find time and go through that particular post. Were we able to do that? This particular link. I taught of the Dart language. I shared this link and asked that we take time and go through it. I hope we did that, because if we did, it will make today's work a bit easier and we can move fast. If you didn't, please do find time after this class and go through all of these. I will try my best to go through as much as I can. And then, yeah. So the first thing we're going to look at is Dart classes. So far, doing our Flutter things, we have done some class things, but yeah, we have worked with classes and all, but we want to something like a deep dive into classes today, and yeah, see how those work here. First, let me just create a test class or something. Let me just call it let me just call it class. No, let me just call it test.dat. Like Java, we learned that to create a class, we use a class keyword. Okay, so the class keyword followed by the name you want to give to the class. In this case, I'm naming my class test. Okay, I'm naming my class test, and then you finish it off with these curly braces. Okay, so this is a class. That's how we define a class in Dart, and that's the same way we define it in Java as well. Except Java, you most likely see public, but Dart doesn't have the public keyword. It doesn't have the private keyword either. So for that, it's just class followed by the name, and then the body of the class, which is indicated by the curly braces. Like Java, a class can have properties or fields. Okay, so let's say this test class is going to have an integer property called say test int. Okay, let's say it's going to have a string property or field called test string. So these are fields for our class. Don't worry about the red lines, we will handle those. So there's a class, and my class has two fields, test int and test string. Okay. Now, so we did this when we were doing Java, so there is nothing strange. No, yeah, there isn't strange. There's something we are already used to. So yeah, that's how you create instance variables for your classes. And we also have a class can also have a constructor. We know the constructor is the language's way of creating an instance of a particular class. So we can have a constructor for our test class. And as when we're learning the constructors in Java, I remember we said in most languages the constructor has the same name as the class it belongs to. So in this case, our constructor will have the same name as its class, and that's test, followed by these braces, these brackets. Okay, so there's a constructor. Again, don't worry about the red line. We'll handle that. Yeah, so we have our class. It has a constructor. It has a constructor here, and it also has member. It has fields or properties. Okay, and we know constructors usually we pass arguments to them. Okay, so how do we pass arguments to constructor in that? Just like we did in Java. We can have our int. Let's say int test int. Let me just call it you fine test int. It's cool. So this is the same way we did it in Java, right? And we can also we have our string as well. String test string. Then we need to pass the value, the arguments that have been passed. We need to assign those values. We need to assign those values to we need to assign those values to our fields. And to do that, we can introduce a body for our constructor. So within our constructor's body, we can assign the values. I'm going to use the this keyword which I introduced us to. We introduced it was introduced to us in the Java. This thing is the same. The this keyword here is just referencing the particular class we are inside right now. So right now we are inside the test class. So this is just referencing the test class we are inside. So if I call this, I can see all the properties and all the functions that are within the class we are inside. So on my this, I can have access to test int. I can have access to test string. So that's what we have here. This is the test int, and then I'll give the value that was passed here to it. Test int. Okay. And then I'll do the same for my test string. Okay, so now our constructor is accepting these two arguments or parameters, and then it will assign those values to our member fields. Do you get it? Now you are seeing some blue lines here. Yeah, don't worry. This is the way you would have done it in Java, but that makes it simpler for you. Okay, that makes it simpler in that instead of having all of this, you can just use the this dot directly within here. You can use the this dot directly, so you wouldn't need the body. Okay, and so that makes it very, very easy and concise for you, rather than having to write so many lines to do all of this job. That just lets you use the fields directly in the constructor. So it just takes whatever will be passed and to assign it directly to whatever variable to the variable in question. If you have any question as I go on, you can ask away and we can address it for you. Yeah, so there's a rough recap of what we did in Java with classes. Let's take a look at functions as well. Functions within classes. A class can have various functions. So let's say this class has a function that returns a string called let's say void, and let's say it's going to print content. Okay, this print content function, let's say what it's going to do is it's going to print the values of the fields within our class. So I can have my print function just like Java has. In Java we have the system dot out dot print line, and that's where you pass the values to print. Okay, that version is simple and concise, and that's print. Okay, so that version of system dot blah 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 is just print. So within my print function, I can pass the values I want to print, and that's let me see if I can do this. Test int plus test string. Okay, this doesn't work. I wanted to do it in Java, and then okay, so there's something we call string concatenation. Okay, let me tackle that, and then we can handle this. There's something we call string concatenation. Sorry, string interpolation. String interpolation is you putting some values within a string. Let me demonstrate it. So we have a string called, let's say the values are, then over here I want to print the values, but we know that I cannot just write test string test int and test string like this, because these are within quotes, so the language will interpret this as just test int and test string, but what we want is the value it's holding. Okay, so how do we get the value it's holding? We can use string interpolation to do that. To do that, just precede the variable with a dollar sign. Okay, precede the variable with a dollar sign, and what the language will do is, instead of printing the variable's name, it will rather give you the variable's value. Do you get it? So if test int, say it was holding the value 5 is what will be given to the string, and let's say test string had the value Kofi, then the final string here will be the values are 5 and Kofi. Do you get it? But if I take away this, the dollar signs, then instead of the values within the variables, it will just give us, it will just treat the names as raw string. But that's not what we want. We rather want its values. So to do that, we have to introduce the dollar sign, and that's what we call string interpolation. Okay, that's what we call string interpolation. Let's see if this actually works as expected. To do that, I'm going to create another class. That would be our entry point. Let me just call it my entry point. That's that. And we know the main entry point of Flutter, which is that of Dart applications, is the main method, as we have said in the various classes. So I have my main method here. Within my main method, I'm going to create an instance of my test class. So again, in Java, we know that if you want to create an instance of a class, you first of all proceed with the class's name. In this case, my class name is test. I have to import my test class. Okay, so test, then I give it a name. So let's call it test, then equal to, then you use the new keyword, then the constructor of the class, and if the constructor accepts any values, you give it those values. In this case, it's expecting an integer and a string. Okay, so let's say Kofi. Do you get it? However, in the new version of, I think from that version 2, the new keyword is no longer required, so you can get rid of the new keyword. Okay, if you're doing Java, the new keyword, you have to bring the new keyword, but that allows you to do it without specifying the new keyword. So get used to that, and don't use the new keyword in that. Actually, don't use it. Yeah, I just did it so you can draw the line between this and Java and see the similarities and how it translates from Java to that. So this is how you can create an instance of you can create a variable, a test, in this case a test variable that's of type test, and it's having a value of this. Okay, now there's also another way we could have done this. That has a keyword called var that we can use to create variables. To use that, let me use that. Instead of specifying the type directly, I can just use the var keyword and then I'll give it a name. So let's say new test, and then I'll give it a value. Let me change the values in here. Good job. Okay, so this is the same as this, except with the first one we specify the type explicitly. We tell that hey, the type of this variable is test, but over here we leave it to that to actually find the type for itself. So what it does is it will infer the type of our variable from the value that has been assigned to it. In this case, the value that has been assigned to our new test variable is test. Okay, so that will infer from this value that our variable is of type test, as you can see here. This new test is of type test. Do you get it? So this is helpful in a case where there's some external library you are using. Let's say there's a method somewhere that returns a test. Let's say it returns a string. Fine, yeah, a string, a method, username. Let's say something like that. Okay, and then this method returns John. Okay, so let's say we have this method fetch username that returns this, but we don't know this method exists somewhere. We didn't write this method. Okay, let's assume that, and I don't know the type. There's a way I can find the type. I can go and dig around and find the type, but I don't have time to go and do that. So it's the easier things to do is to just use var and then name. Let's say the variable name is username, and then I'll call my fetch username method. Okay, as you can see, the type has not been specified anywhere. So that will do what? That will infer from whatever value this method will return. And this method returns a string, which means our variable username will also be of type string. Okay, so it makes it easier for you to create variables without having to be specifying the types here and there. Do you get it? So these are two ways you can create instances of variables. You can also use the final keyword. I'll talk about that one a bit in a bit. Okay, you can use final instead of var. That also works. But for now, let's just keep this. Let's get rid of this guy. Let's get rid of these two and change this from this to var. Okay, now let's go on and call the method. You know, when you create a class, you use the dot operator, which is called the access. I think, yeah, the access operator to access all the various fields and methods that are within our class. In this case, our test class, we created two variables, two fields within it, the test int field and the test string field, and we created one function. That's the print contents function. Okay, so these are the three things that we created within our class. As you can see, there are some other things. There are some other things within the class, like the hash code, the runtime type, the toString, and the no such method. These exist by default in all classes. Okay, so you don't worry about those for now. I think we'll talk about them as time goes on, especially the toString. Okay, so for now, focus on the ones we created within it. That's the test int, the test string, and then the print content method. Right now, I want to call the print content. I've created an instance of my test class. I've given it these values, and I know, as we saw, my print content function, its job is to just print that the values are blah blah and blah blah. Okay, so let's see if that actually works. With that, let me run that. that ran entry point. Okay, and as expected, it ran our code, and the results we were expecting is what got printed. The values are 5 and Kofi. Do you see? So the call to print content did exactly what we wanted. So let's demonstrate if I didn't bring the $signs. Let's see what it prints in that scenario. You see, instead of giving us the values, it rather printed the variable names, test int and test string. Okay, so string interpolation is a cool thing actually. It's in so many other languages as well, but it looks like it's not in Java. Yeah, so interpolation. If you have any questions so far, please feel free to ask. Now, with this, what happens is our constructor is accepting these two arguments, and these two arguments are required by default. When you create the constructor, when you create an instance of the test class, you have to specify those values. Okay, you have to specify a value for test int, you have to specify a value for test string. It's required, it's implicitly required. You have to pass them. Okay, if I take these out, there will be a red line telling me things. Okay, so there's a red line under it, and if you hover over it, it's telling me that there are 2 positional arguments accepted, but 0 were found. All this is saying is it's expecting 2 arguments as we did here. There are 2 things. It's expecting 2, but then 0 were found. 0 because we didn't pass anything to it. So its recommendation is try adding the missing arguments. So if you see any error like that, it means the constructor is expecting that you pass some values to it. So just pass those values. Cool. Now, that has something we call named parameters. Okay, named parameters. Over here, as you see, I just pass the values directly to it. With name parameters, I can specify the name of the fields, then the name of the argument. In this case, the first argument is test int. Okay, so I can specify it this way: that test int is 5, and then test string is Kofi. Okay, that's what named parameters does. But we have not asked it to be named parameters. That's why we are getting the red line. So let's go on and do that. How do we make it make the parameters named? To do that, just wrap the parameters within curly braces, and they will become named by default. So as you can see, that bug is fixed. So this helps you like to identify. Previously, when I didn't have the names over there, it was just 5 and Kofi. You will be wondering, what is the 5 and what's the Kofi? What's the class expecting? And okay, I don't know if you understand me. So with the names, it becomes easier for you to know what's expected. So if anyone looks at the code, they know that, oh, okay, so this class is expecting a test int, and we are passing 5 to it. It's expecting a test string, we are passing Kofi to it. You don't have to explicitly go into the class and go and check for the names to know. You just look at where we are using it, and then you know from there. Okay, so now let's address this issue. When we hover over it, it's telling us that the parameter test int can't have a value of null because of the implicit default. Wait, let me tell this guy. It's saying the parameter test int can't have a value of null because of its type, but the implicit default value is what is null. Now let's do a little deep dive into this. I think that's version 2 point something going. No, there's something called null safety. It's been enabled by default. So anytime you create a variable, by default, this variable cannot have a value of null. Okay, let's demonstrate. If I assign a value now to this, it won't work. It's giving me red. You see, it's telling me that a value of type null cannot be assigned to a variable of type int. In Java, this would have worked, because with Java, everything can be null. Okay, But with that, if you want something to be null, you have to explicitly tell it that, hey, I want this guy to be null. So to do that, we use the question mark, the question mark symbol. Okay, so this tells the language that this particular variable test int can have a null value. I hope it's clear. It tells it that this guy can have a null value. If we want, and the way to do that is just put a question mark after its type. If we want to make our test string also have a null value, we can put a question mark after its type, and then our test string can also be null. Do you get it? So with that, by default, no variable can be null. Nothing can be null. If you want something to be null, you have to explicitly tell it that I want you to be null. And the way to do that is to use a question mark. Again, if there's any question, you can ask away and then, yeah. But what if we don't want this to be null? As you saw, when I introduced a null, our bug was fixed. So what if I don't want any of these to be null? How do I do that? The way to do that is to make is to tell, like as I said earlier, that when we were creating this class, we're forced to pass values for these two fields. That's because they are required. Okay, that's because they were required. So what we can do here is we can make them required again. When you introduce the named the curly braces for the named parameters, it makes everything within that named within the parentheses. Sorry, it makes everything within the curly braces optional. Okay, so it makes all of these optional. So if you want something within the curly braces to not be optional, just tell it to be required, and then your error is fixed. Our test string, if you want it to also be required, just put a required keyword, and then it's fixed as well. Okay, so to recap, by default, if you let me introduce another constructor here. Can I be introduced to constructors with the same name? Let's see if this will work. Okay, I would have to probably use some other. Let's do this. So the first thing we had first time we had this test int and we had test string. Okay, with this way, you by force you have to pass values for these two. Okay, implicitly they are required without we having to directly specify the required keyword. Okay, we didn't have to specify this because if they are required by default. But when you introduce the curly braces, it doesn't just allow you to reference them by name when you are instantiating like we did here. It doesn't just allow you to do that. It also makes everything within the curly braces optional. Okay, instead of making it required by default, it makes it optional by default. Do you get it? So to make them required again, you have to use a required keyword as we did up there. I hope that's clear, and it's not, and yeah, I hope it's clear. So with this, we have now we know what named parameters are. We know what named parameters are, and what. Let's introduce another parameter in here. Say let's say test bool. Okay, let's make this test bool nullable. Okay, so you see, because it's null by default. If something is optional, it means you can pass it or you cannot pass it. You can choose to pass it, or you can choose to not pass it. Okay, so I could even take this out and we wouldn't have an issue. Okay, we can also still choose to supply it, but you realize that I've added this test bool to our constructor, but I'm not passing it here. I'm not passing it through into the constructor. It's showing here. I can choose to pass a value, say false, to it, or I can choose to not pass it. Why? Because it is optional. And the reason why it's not giving us any red here is because it's allowed to be null. Because of this question mark, it's allowed to be null. So by default, it is null. And if something is optional and you don't pass it, it's null by default. Do you get it? That's why we don't have any error for this guy. But if this didn't have the question mark, then it's expected to have a value which is not null. But the default here, because it's within the optional curly braces, its default value is now null. But it cannot be null as specified by its type. So if we don't want it to be null like the others, we use the required keyword. If we want it to be null, we put a question mark here, and then we are cool. I hope it's clear.
Okay,
yeah,
cool. So
yeah,
can you create a constructor with this optional arguments without passing any value in it, where do you have the required keyword there?
Yeah. As in, can I create a constructor and I will not pass values for test int and test string?
You can create, like, you instantiating the constructor, like when you go to the other class, you delete everything in the constructor, like you create a new instantiation of the constructor. Yeah, don't pass
anything.
So you have the optional
like this
required. Yeah. Is it going to work?
No, it won't work because because these two guys are required, so we have to provide values for them, but this one is not required, so we can choose to not pass a value for this one, but for these two we are required to supply values for them.
So if you don't want to pass anything,
hovering over it, if you don't want to pass anything, then you either make it nullable, make them nullable and take away the required, and then your error is fixed.
Okay.
As long as you have marked it as required, you have to supply a value for it. If you don't want to supply a value, you can either make it required. Yeah, I think I have to talk about one other thing. You can either make it nullable, like we did. What am I saying? If you don't want to supply any value, yeah, you can make them nullable and take away the required so that you don't pass anything. Or you can make them non-nullable, that they cannot accept null values and still take away the required. Though this is flagging, but there's something we can do. There's something called default values. You can give them default values. So my test int, I can say its default value is 0. Okay. And I can say my test string is default value is an empty string. And this fixes our error. And I'm not passing any value to it. And yet I didn't make them null. You see, yet I didn't make them nullable. So they cannot accept null values. But then they are not required either. And they are not, it's not flagging me that there's an error. So that's one way to solve it. You can either make them required, and which will force whoever is using this code to provide values, or you can give them default values so that if they don't pass values, the default values will rather be used. So in this case, if I change this test to new test, because we are not passing any values, the default values, let me use real values for this default values. 0, and let's say nothing. Let me just say default. Okay, so if I use the constructor that we are not passing anything to, if we don't pass anything to the constructor, the default values will rather be used. So let's run that and see what will happen. Exactly as expected. So we didn't pass any values to it. So it used the default value for our test int, which is 0, and the default value for our test string, which is default, as we specified in the constructor's definition, 0 and default. I hope it's clear.
Yeah, sure.
So with this, we can do the same for our test bool as well. If we don't want this one to have null values, we can get rid of the question mark. And to fix this red error, we can again either make it required, which will force whoever is using our code to pass a value, or we can just give it a default value. And then we don't have to change anything here. Yeah. Any question again from the others? Okay. So on data types, like we did in Java, we got to learn of various data types, int, long, bool, and many others, string, array, and a bunch of others that we got to learn of in Java. Data types are present in every programming language. That also has its own data types. It has a lot of these as well, except with that. Okay, there's long. Let me just add double here. Java also has float and a lot of data types. But with that has int. For the numbers, it has just int and double, and it has one other called num. Okay, so these are the three number data types that are present in that. Java has int, it has long, it has double, it has float, but that simplifies all of these into just these three: int and double, and num. It also has string, as Java has. For arrays, it has arrays as well. Okay, but in that, arrays are called lists. Okay, that implementation of arrays is what we call a list. So you won't see array in that, you rather see list, but they are the same thing. So that don't let it confuse you. Yeah, I think these are them. Okay, yeah, and then bool. Okay, it has bool, just like Java also has bool. That also has bool. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I think with Java's one is Boolean, and that's is bool.
Java's is Boolean. Sorry.
Like I'm saying, for Java is Boolean, and that is bool.
That is bool. Okay, thank you.
And even with Java, they have
So
decimal, big decimal, and other things, but we don't have it.
Yeah, Java has a lot. That
Yeah, they have
simplifies
it.
them for you. Okay, so all the things we learned in Java about these types, they are the same here. Okay, they are the same here in that. So please go and watch those videos to revise. And the only difference is how you are going to define declare variables, like, and that I've addressed that as well for you guys here. I've addressed it here for that. So sorry, it's actually the same as the Java one. Yeah, hello. I thought you were saying something. Okay. So like I said, for that, use. Come again. Hello.
I mean, sorry. Yeah, I thought
I can't hear you, but okay. So with that, like I said, you use a var. Most variables you'll be creating, you probably use var or final. Let me talk about the final here. The final keyword, I'm sure we touched on it when we were treating Java modifiers. When you create a variable and you name it as final, so let's say final test2. I don't pass any values to it. What this means is this variable I've created and this value I've passed to it is final. I cannot change it later in the app. Okay, so if later I try to give this test2 a new value, you see it's underlined it as red. It's, if you read the error, it's saying the final variable test2 can only be set once. Do you get it? So if you create a variable with a final keyword, you can only give it a value once, and you cannot change its value again. So if your code requires that some variable has be assigned just once, and then you cannot change it again, then use final instead of var. Do you get it? So over here, you see we didn't change any of the values for test, so it's best to just use final instead of var. Okay, but if I use var, let's take the new test for instance. Because I said it's var, I can change its value to some other test. Let's say I give it I change the test string value to something. Okay, so you see this worked. I was able to change the value of new test to another instance of tests because I used the var keyword. But if I had used final, it wouldn't have worked because with final you can only give it a value once and that's it. Do you get it? And that's usually it's advisable that when you create classes, your fields be final. It's advisable that you make all your fields final unless the particular class you are creating requires that along the line you change the values within it. Otherwise, it's advisable that you make everything final so that the values are assigned just once and you cannot change them later. If you want to change them, there's a copy with method that you have to create or something, or you have to create a new instance and then pass the values of this one to that one. I'm sure we'll probably talk about those things the deeper we go. Okay, so for now, it's best if yeah, it's advisable that you make everything final in here, but you don't have to. Okay, you don't have to. Yeah, so that's final and var to create variables. And again, we have seen this. Let me just create some variables of these types. I can create an int number, okay, and give it a value of 1. This is the same way you would have done it in Java, okay, but that gives you another way, as we have seen with var and with final. Okay, so with var, that will infer from the value we have given it. The value is 1. That will infer and know that 1 is an integer, and it will implicitly give our number variable a type of int without we specifying it ourselves. Okay, so we could have done int number equal to 1, or var number equal to 1, or final number equal to 1. Do you get it? Same with our double. So let's say double and double equal to 1.1. Okay, again, I can change this to var, and that will infer from this value and know that this guy is a double. Okay, now let's talk a bit about num, since there's nothing like it. There's nothing like it existing in any of the languages. So let me try and explain that. So let's say I create a num variable and name it my num and give it a value of 1. Okay, you check its type is of type num. The thing with num is when you create a variable of type num, you can either give it an integer value or you can give it a double value. Okay, so a num variable can hold any value, can hold any number value at all, whether it's an integer or it's a double. Okay, so I can give it 1. I can also give it 1.1 and it won't crash. It will be the same. Okay, so num can hold integer values. It can also hold double values. I cannot do the same with integer. Okay, it gives me red. It's saying a value of type double cannot be assigned to a variable of type int. My number here is an integer. The value I'm giving it is a double. That will not work. Okay, but num allows you to do that because num can hold both integers and doubles. Do you get it? So if your code requires that some variable hold both numbers and doubles at different points in time, you can use it a num variable. It's most likely you will never have to use it anyway, but if the need arises, it's available for you to use. Okay, and just like with we can use var rather than specify. I say, okay, if I use var, that will infer directly and know that this is a double, and it will give it double. So if you know in advance that this guy can be an integer and can also be a double, just give it num. You get to specify the type yourself. So string like we did in Java. Okay.
So in this case, what will be the
Yes.
difference between the num data type and double data type? Because I know double two can hold integers. No, it's not advisable, but then I know it's that.
Yeah. With the double, I can do this. I can give my double an integer value. Okay. But what happens is when the value is put into this double this it's going to tell me it's an integer because I haven't specified the type, and this is an integer, so it infers and make this guy an integer. So let me just specify the type myself, double. Okay, so what that does is it takes this integer and it just converts it into a floating point number and it stores it in my variable. So though I said 1, that will store it as 1.0. Okay, yeah, so yeah, that will store it as 1.0 instead of 1. So it will make it a double.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in this case, they are all.
But with the num.
Yeah. So they are all like doing the same thing.
As in the double and the num.
Yeah, the double and the num. But then the only difference is the num will save it as it is. If it is an integer, to save it as integer. If it's a double, it will save it as a double. But the double, if you assign the integer it will rather convert it to the floating point.
It will cast it to a double.
Yeah. It's when we are treating memories as we learned the other time, saving things into memory and you saving memory. These are some of the things that we normally take into consideration, especially if you have a value and in Java, when you want to specify which data type to use. If you say you have 2.1, do I use double? Do I use float? Do I use decimal? So all those things, you use them and it will work for you, though, but then you need to also think about the memory that you are using, the memory space you are using for that particular data you want to, that small data you want to store. So I think that data also, the memory also comes in here. Why you should use the num and the double and the int.
Thank you. And also with the num, so the initial value of my num variable is a double. Obviously, it's 1.1, which is a double. Okay, I can somewhere down my code give it an integer value, let's say 3, and it won't flag me, you see. So the num at any point in time can hold an integer value, it can hold a double value. So yeah, that's if your code requires that your variables be able to do that, num is available for you to use. Otherwise, just stick with the one you need. Yeah. So string, we have worked with strings a lot. String, my string to an empty string. Let me just say my string. Okay, and with that, you can create strings using the double quote. In Java, you can create strings with just the double quote, but in that, you can create a string with either the double quote or a single quote. So this is the same, it's all strings. The initial value of my string here is my string, and then I've given it a new value here of a new string. First one I use a double quote, second one I use single quote. They are the same, so you can choose to either use the single quote or the double quote to create strings. They'll work the same for you. Let's go on to list. I think time is gone. Should I continue?
Yeah, so I think we can finish with the data types and we can continue another time.
Okay. So list, like I said, a list is an array. Okay, that calls its lists, its arrays lists. In some programming languages, they have a list data type and they have an array data type as well. They have both. But that doesn't have array. It just has the list, but they are the same thing. Okay, so don't be confused. So like we created arrays in Java, we can create a list. Okay, let me just var here. Let's say a list, my list. And in Java, I think in Java we used double curly braces like this, or we can do that in Java, but in that, the easiest way to create a list, first of all, I think let's just use the constructor. We can create a list. Yeah, don't worry about the crossbar. Let's say I give it a value of say 1, 2. Oops, too many. Sorry, I cannot pass values to it. Create a list like this. Say it's a list of integers. I didn't want to do this, but like let me just go straight to the point. Okay, so in that, if you want to create a list, just there's a symbol we just use to create this, and that's this angle brackets. Okay, so if you see angle brackets like this anywhere in your code, it's a list or an array. Okay, so if we check this, it's saying the type of my list here is list dynamic. Let's talk about this these angle brackets with the dynamic thing. What it's doing is this list. I think I have. Let me talk. Let me talk about generics.
There are a lot of things. The dynamic too.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So there's something we call generics. Okay. A list. Let's come to our normal world things. We can have a list of so many things. I can have a list of names. I can have a list of numbers. Okay. I can have a list of places, a list of countries, a list of items within a house. Okay. So I can have a list of so many different types of things. So how do I translate that into programming? To do that, I have to tell the language that this list is going to be a list of numbers. Okay, it's going to be a list of integers. It's going to be a list of strings. And the way to do that is these angle brackets. Okay, so I'll say a list of integers. Do you get it? A list of integers. And then I give it a name, my list. And I can give it a value. So with this, the default value for my list is an empty list. There are no values in here, so it's an empty list. But I can pass values to it. Let's say I give it the values 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so my list now has 3 items, and these 3 items are integers. So the way I told that my list is going to hold integers is by specifying the integer type within these angle braces here for the list type. Do you get it? So this one way I could have done it, or I could have done var or final, one of the two, and then over here I will specify that same thing here. Do you get it? So these are the two ways I can create items of generic types. I can either specify the type here, or I can do it here. Like, yeah, let me just create specify the type here instead. Okay. And if I do this is redundant. Okay, I've specified the type here, and I've specified it here as well. I just need it at one place. Okay, so I don't have to specify it twice. So this is the same thing. Okay, I can create it this way or that way. Okay, so this generics. Anything that can be of different types, usually it's implemented as a generic something. So you would have to specify the particular type when you are creating it. The same way I have my list of integers, I can have my a list of strings. I can have a list of strings, and I'll specify. Let me just create the list first. Okay, there's a list. Right now, this list is not holding any values, so that doesn't know the values my list is going to hold. It needs that, so it will give it a type. That's why by default it uses the type called dynamic. Dynamic is a type in that, and with that one, it will not try to find the type as you are coding or as you are compiling the code. It will rather wait for you to run the code, and then it will try to find the type. That's dynamic. Don't worry if the explanation is not clear. I believe we'll talk about it later. But for now, with dynamic, if you create something, you say it's dynamic, that will not worry about finding its type as you are coding or as you are compiling the code. It will wait for you to run the code, and as the code is running and it gets to that point, it will try. That's when it will look for whatever type that particular thing is. Okay, so that's a dynamic. So over here, there's no value. If there's no value passed to my string, passed to my list, so it doesn't know what my list is going to hold. It doesn't know if my list is going to hold integers or numbers or something, or strings or even complex objects. It doesn't know, so it makes it dynamic by default. So it will try to guess by what value it will be holding when it's running. Okay, so if I want to tell it that, oh, you don't worry about, I want you to find a type right now, so I'm going to tell you, then I can specify this way that, okay, my list is going to hold strings. I can do this, or if I want to give my list values by default, I can just go on and say, and give it values. Okay, and now that has enough information to infer what type my list is going to be. Okay, you see this right now, I didn't specify the string here. I didn't. Why? Because I know now that has information. How? Because this list now is holding values, 2 strings. Okay, it's holding 2 string values. So it now infers that my list is going to be a list of strings. So as you can see, it's no longer a list of dynamic, but it's rather a list of strings. Do you get it? So if my list is going to be, if I don't have values to put in my list, then I have to specify the type. I can specify the type to make things straightforward. Okay, I can specify the type here, or I can specify it this way. I can specify it the string and not have to do it here. Do you get it? But if I'm going to give it values, then I don't have to write all these plenty things. I can just do my var or my final, and then I can just give it values 1, 2. I hope it's clear. Sorry.
Okay. Cool.
Excuse me.
So what about give another third item and enter an integer?
Another thing. Okay. So let's say I put int here, an integer here.
Yeah. So
As
now
you see, I did not specify a type.
yes.
Okay, I have not explicitly specified. If I had done this, if I had told that this guy is going to be a string, then you see it has underlined the 1 with a red, telling me that this element is of type int and it cannot be assigned to our list, which is of type string. Do you get it? So with that one, it will flag me and I'll have to change it. But if I don't specify it, I'm leaving that to find a type that will work for all of these things. Okay, so it will find a type. What type works for all of these 2 different items? There are 2 different items here, strings and an integer. What type works for all of these? And then it will infer that object works for them. Okay, so let's talk a bit about object here. Every type, every every data type in that inherits from a parent class called object. Okay, so a string is of type object, an integer is of type object, a list is of type object. Everything in that is of type object except for null. Okay, anything for the null, if you are, that's when you are using null safety. Right now we are using null safety. So now only null does not inherit from objects, but everything else inherits from objects. So right now we didn't specify the type, but we put 2 different types in here. So that looks which ancestor is common to these 2 different types. Which ancestor is common to a string and is common to an integer, and is the object. So it makes it that my list is now a list of objects. Do you get it? So if you don't want your list to be a list of objects, then you specify the type. Say my list has to be a string, then I have no choice than to either take this integer out or make it a string. Okay, I hope it answers your question.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank God. What else? Yeah, any question on lists or arrays? Okay, if there's
So
none,
how do you
uh,
how do you determine the size of the array or the list?
yeah, you see in Java, you just take your array and then you call the length. This guy also has the same thing. So the length will count the number of items within your array or your list, and it will just, so that's the length, the size of your array, of your list. Do you get it? You see, with Java, with the arrays, you have to, yeah, when you create it, you can either give it the size by default as you are creating it. Okay, you can say int array, and then say how do you even create arrays? I've forgotten all of those things. Int,
So
and
I
then say
think
the size is 5.
yeah, and you put the number there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the difference between lists and arrays is that with array, when you specify the size, like that's it. You cannot. That's why we get array out of bounds. You cannot add more items than you have specified here. You cannot add more than 5 items. It will always be 5 or less. Do you get it? But with list, the size can keep increasing. Okay, with list, your size can keep increasing. So I have this string list here. I can come here and string list. There's a method called add. I can add more. Okay, I can add more to it. I can add more. Okay, and I won't get any array out of bounds error. Okay, so list by default, list allows you, lists can grow. Okay, if you have a list of favorite items, let's say when you were 5 years old, you had a list of favorite items, and that list only was holding three things that were your favorite. That doesn't mean that it has to stay like that. Okay, as you go, you get more favorite items. Some of the things that were favorite are no longer favorite, so your list can change. So a list allows that it can grow or it can shrink, unlike an array. You get it? So that you can keep adding items. As you can add items, so can you remove items. So can you remove items? Okay. So if I want to remove 3, yeah, I just pass 3. So it will remove 3 from my list. Okay. So a list. So as you can see, I'm accessing some methods from my list. So lists have various methods that you can use. It has a length property, a reversed, and so many other things. First will give you the first item in your list. It's empty. We'll check to see if your list is empty. If it's empty, it will return true. If it's not empty, it will return false. There's another, it's not empty, which does the opposite of it's empty. Okay, there's an iterator which allows you to loop over your list. There's a last, which will return the last item in your list. Okay, and for all of these things, if you select it, there's a pop-up here that will give you all the most of the info you need to know. So if you read that, and then yeah, you get to understand. There's an add all. Let's try and use the add all. The add all, it accepts an iterable. An iterable is basically a list. Okay, so you can give another list to here, to this guy. So let's say I have another let's make these lists, these item strings, these strings, and change this to say var. Okay, so I can add this list here to my string list by just passing this new list to it. Okay, and what it will do is it will append all these values, the 1, 2, and 3. It will append them. It will append it to the values within our string list. Let me print this guy. Let me print my string list. Oops, I'm doing all of this outside. Or wait, not printing my thing.
Scroll the console and see. Oh, that's the
I
last
didn't
one.
save. Okay, yeah, I didn't save my file. So as you can see, my string list was holding, when I created it, I gave it two values, 1 and then 2. Okay, and then I added 3, 4, and 5 to it. And then I removed 3. So as you can see, I removed the 3. And then I added the contents of this new list, which is 1, 2, 3, to the result. To 1, 2, which were there when I created it. And then I added 3, 4, 5. And then I removed 3. So as you can see, 3 is no longer in there. And I added everything in my new list array, just 1, 2, 3. And there they are. So when I printed my list, this is what my list looked like. You cannot do this with an array. You can remove items from the array and add things in there, but you cannot append. You cannot exceed the size the array was when you created it. Do you get it? But a list allows you to do that. Cool. So you can go and play around with all of the various
I think
methods
we can
present in a
quickly
list.
the booleans.
Okay. So Boolean, just like we saw in Java, is the same thing over here. If you want to create a bool, then they type my bool or something, and then give it a value. Okay. A bool can either be true or false. Yeah, so that's it. And just like this, I can either specify the type explicitly, or I can allow that to infer the type from the value assigned to it. Okay, so if I use var, like I said, that will infer and know that this guy is assigned a value true, which is a boolean. Then it will know that it's a bool, or false, which is also a bool. It knows. Yeah. So that's it with boolean.
Okay, great.
If there were time, we would have talked about the null equivalent of all of these, but no problem. I think we'll do that later.
Sure. Okay, great. I think we have like 4 minutes to 9. If there's any question, you can bring it up so that we wrap up. Within this short time, we've really learned a lot. In fact, we've done a great job. We went through a lot of things with us. So we've learned how to create classes in that, how to create constructors, and the constructors we've learned about named parameters and positional arguments, and we've learned about the null safety, how to go about the null safety stuff. We've learned about the data that we have in Flutter or that. So I think we've really gone far within this short period. Though we didn't join it, but then I think we've done a great job. If you have any question, you can bring it up. With this, please, when we after this class, when we just go to the YouTube, normally we download and put it on the YouTube page. Even if you don't share it, you have the links, you can go there, it's in the playlist and watch for yourself. Please do well to watch and just revise and go over and over before you can tackle some of the assignments. If you don't understand, just pass us on the page. If you have any issue or any problem, just pass us on the page or direct message us so that we can help you. It seems like some of you are being left behind. Please, we don't want that. We want all of us to be on the same page. So any issue that you are facing, just let us know so that we can also help you. If you have anything, I think you can bring it up before we close. We have like 2 minutes here. Okay. All right, cool. James, anything again?
Yeah, I think that's it. So I've shared the link to the that language tour again on the in the chat in the group. So please find time and go through those. It covers everything we've covered here and even more. So try and go through those to acquaint yourself with that. So when we are using them in Flutter, things will be easier for you. That's all.
All right. Thanks very much. Myself, I've learned something new today. The num variable, the data type. So I think it's good. So guys, let's catch up on Friday. I don't know whether we will have an assignment or this, but then we will plan and do something before Friday. The previous assignment that we gave you, please, those who haven't done them, please try as much as possible to do them and paste it on the page just to motivate us. Let's look at what you've done. All right, without anything again, I think we can close here. Thank you very much for joining. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.